Now, this brings us to a point of ludicrousness and absurdity, which is kind of familiar, I think, to all of us watching this, which is where, to put it crudely or in a caricatured way, you have lesbian activists or trans activists on US campuses supporting what are basically far-right movements of political Islam, in whose view the correct judgment on the practice of homosexuality would be the imposition of the death penalty.
My guest today, I'm very pleased to say, is Dr. Jonathan Spyer. Jonathan is an accomplished journalist, a war correspondent, a freelancer. You've seen his columns in many places, from the Wall Street Journal to the Spectator and many more. He's an IDF veteran who saw combat in the Second Lebanon War. Jonathan, greetings, salutations, shalom, welcome to the podcast. And would you introduce yourself a little more in more detail for our audience? You've lived a rather colorful, storied life. Say a bit more about who you are.
Sure. Well, yeah. Hi, Gabe, first of all, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, as you said, I'm a journalist, and I work in the field across the Middle East and a little bit beyond it. I've been working also in Ukraine, covering events there also over the last decade, on and off. I do write for a variety of publications. I'm currently director of the research at the Middle East Forum think tank, and I edit the Middle East Quarterly there, which is that research organization's main magazine. And yeah, I write for a bunch of other publications. You mentioned the Spectator, the Australian newspaper as well. I have a column also at the Jerusalem Post, sometimes for the Wall Street Journal, sometimes also for Jane's Information Group. Jane's Intelligence Review is the publication I write for there. So a bunch of different publications. I do a fair amount of lecturing also to groups coming over here to Israel, or sometimes also abroad. Some consultancy work as well, all in the field very much of Middle East politics, and to some degree also security affairs, and the kind of area, the crossover area between the two, if I can put it that way.
And if I'm not mistaken, you do this somewhat extraordinary thing of actually going to the places that you report about. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something which is of great importance to me in the particular style or particular approach I take to this work. I do believe that the maintenance of a kind of broad network of contact, who I can be pretty much in daily or weekly contact with, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon, in the countries that I deal with, is of vital importance in doing my job for my customer, in a certain sense, which is, bringing information, and hopefully bringing new and original information and providing an original take on it. And then part of that also is traveling to the countries in question. So it's frontline reporting. I do I've kind of, come to be a kind of semi-professional stills photographer as well over the years, because I've found that I can kind of sell packages of both, text and photographs to many of the publications that I write for. And so, yeah, getting in there, getting to the front line, seeing what's happening is a big part of it. I find that getting information in that way is of importance. Often I find I get to things I didn't know I was going to get to. So often when I go to those areas, I was last in Syria in April, which was the last kind of major trip of this kind. I've reported inside Gaza a few times as well. And, that's the way you get to stuff which is unpredictable. You get to new ideas, new angles, new information. So yeah, work in the field is a vital part, I would say, of the approach that I'm trying to take to this area of work.
Thanks for bringing that added value to our podcast. We will get to your experience in Gaza in due course. I'm sure listeners will be interested in that, as I am myself. That this is part of a special podcast series we're conducting under the rubric of Israel's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year, from last summer to this summer. And we're asking guests to help us connect the dots from the proposed judicial reforms of last summer, the protests of last summer against the reforms being proposed shortly prior to that. And then if there are any connections, one can only speculate how did we get from that to October 7? Now, obviously, Hamas had something to do with October 7, but the country was perceived as divided. And so we'll be curious to hear if you think there are any sorts of connections to be made from the condition we were in during the protests and judicial reform period and October 7, and then from there, the aftermath up to the present, Israel's strategic position, any thoughts you might have about where this is headed. And along the way, lastly, well, two other very important things that we like to do in this series is ask each guest to talk about their unique areas of expertise, and we'll be delving into your war correspondent work in that regard. And one other thing, we ask each guest, while we're interviewing primarily Israelis, to comment on the, of all things, American campus scene. Some of our guests have said, well, why are you asking me? And the answer to that is we're interested in an Israeli perspective on it. It's been a dramatic thing in the news. We're not asking for the one right view of exactly what's going on, but we're curious what Israelis who are immersed in all kinds of things relevant to our situation in Israel think about the college campus. And because Telos is a college adjacent journal. It's an independent journal, but we're campus adjacent. And since our field is critical theory, and I happen to know that you're also a trained historian, is that correct? And something of a scholar in your own right, to say the least. Critical theory and some of its perversions have been of interest to us at Telos. So that stuff has saturated the American college campus. Anyway, speaking of Israel's terrible, horrible, very bad, no good year, maybe a counterintuitive question to start. Has there been anything good in your eyes about the last year? There's lots of good things about Israel. We don't have time for all that. Amidst the misery, the pain, the challenges of this last year, I know of one thing that I would say if somebody asked me, but I'd rather ask you, have you seen any good things during this difficult year?
Yeah, I do think there are a number of things which are positive coming out of this terrible time. And the most important one for me is to have noted the cohesion and the response of the younger generation, really, to this. I was with a colleague in the Gaza area on October 8th. And we ran into, whilst we were driving near Kibbutz Zikim in the countryside around there, we ran into a tank crew of young guys who'd just been mobilized, reservists, but people in their mid-20s. And one of the young guys standing on the hull of the tank speaking to us said, this is our generation's Yom Kippur, which of course to Israelis is very clear what he's referring to, obviously referring to the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And expressing the fact that he regarded this as the testing moment, which will be remembered for his generation. I think that was a very accurate and apt thought at that moment. And if we think about this as a test for this generation of those of similar magnitude, arguably maybe even greater, or certainly equal magnitude to that of October 1973, as of now, the generation, in my estimation, appears to have passed with flying colors. Otherwise, those who, it's almost a cliche to say now, those who thought this was the TikTok generation of people who wouldn't have, I don't know, the required attention span or the required seriousness to mobilize in defense of the nation when called upon to do so, those people have undoubtedly been pleasantly surprised by what's taken place. I've spent a few days, no more than that, but a few days in Gaza in the course of the war with a variety of different units, different divisions in the service, in the IDF, and uniformly and throughout. It's just been very, very impressive to see the extent and seriousness of the commitment of those young Israelis to the mission at hand and to completing it successfully. I personally wasn't of the opinion, that the generation wouldn't prove equal to a task of this magnitude. It wasn't that I was prior to October 7th saying, bemoaning the younger generation. I wasn't part of that kind of thing. But nevertheless, having now seen it in action, this is undoubtedly something of which we can all be very proud. And I hope very much that when the guns fall silent, that spirit will not be lost, and that people of that generation, or the few years above it, will be in public life doing what I think is urgently needed, which is cleaning out our public life, cleaning out our institutions, maybe replacing some of the more tired folks that have been there with more energetic and more committed people. So yes, that to me has been a very, very positive thing so far. The other thing, which is a little bit less, one could be less starry-eyed about it, but nevertheless, the way that the country itself actually came together, certainly in the period immediately following October 7th. I mean, to some degree, I think that cohesion has been subsequently subsided to some degree. But certainly in the initial period, I mean, even the initial month or two following October 7th, there was similarly a sense of sort of national mobilization, of national crisis and emergency, and a need to respond effectively to that. And I think that the country as a whole also came together. And the spirit of volunteerism in the general public has not entirely subsided. It's still going on. People doing everything they can to support the soldiers and their families, to support the families of the kidnapped people and those abductees who have been returned. This is also an element of Israeli life, in which I think we can all take some justified pride.
It is something to see our young men and women in green all over the place, more even than usual, and I guess pretty much the whole country shares your enthusiasm for this. I know I do. In the States, since you mention it, the young have moved farther and farther to the left, and have not frankly given signs of a vast reserves of valor and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, which the IDF soldiers really have, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
Here, the young are, even if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, more and more to the right, relatively speaking, to the population. Is there anything more you can say about that to us? Because to an American audience, that in itself will be shocking. We're not addressing all the American audience, we're addressing a world audience, but
yeah. Well, first of all, I think that we're already 2 generations into this process. Oh, it's the generation of which you and I are a part. In the Israeli context, was already a more right-wing generation than the one before it, because we are the generation who, as young people, or I guess at the time probably in our late 20s, witnessed the collapse of the peace process and the emergence of the Second Intifada. So we were the people who were already in young adulthood when the illusions of the grand illusions, if one could put it that way, of the 1990s peace process that followed, of course, the US victory in the Cold War, and took place within that context of notions of the moment of end of history and so on. That decade of illusions, collapsed around our ears, so to speak, in 2000, when we were still quite young people. So people of our age and a little bit younger, I mean, here in Israel, were the generation of disenchantment, were the generation who abandoned the illusions of the 90s and adopted a much more, I would say, hard and realist, hard-nosed realist outlook, so to speak. So there's already, of course, now a generation below us who are currently engaged in the fighting in Gaza. So it was already our generation that were the kind of post-illusion, post-peace process generation, who were regarded as being what's called in this context right-wing. Again, I don't mind using these terms because they indicate people know what you're talking about when you use them, but I don't think this really means right-wing in the sense that it's used, certainly not in Europe, and I think also not in America either, in the sense there's no reflection here regarding people's views on social or economic issues, or issues of public spending or anything like that. You can have views that would be regarded in Europe, for example, as left-wing on all those matters, and still be considered right-wing in our context if you don't have illusions regarding the intentions of the Arab Muslim neighbors towards us. So in that sense, right-wing, our generation was already becoming more right-wing than the last one. And this generation, I think, has followed in a similar direction. It derives from, in their case, an absence of illusion. They didn't grow up and witness the collapse of illusions. They grew up amidst a post-illusion context, a context of ongoing, intractable conflict between our our Israeli Jewish national project here, and the attempt by various Arab and Muslim forces to destroy it. So that's the reality that they know. So yeah, they're very different in that respect to their co-generationalists, if that's the word, in the United States or in Europe. And yes, I think also more broadly, the intellectual currents that you mentioned in North America and in to a lesser extent maybe in Western Europe are even less present here, I would say. They maybe find their way in to a fairly small, very, very westernized section of the population and section of the younger generation. I mean, they're present in some degree in that regard, but they don't have anything like the kind of commanding presence that they have in the United States at the moment among, let's say, educated youth. I mean, I would say, we should, I'm no expert on the United States, but my sense is that we should maybe caveat that slightly. It's not sort of it's not the entire younger generation in the US, but certainly the college-going, university educated element of the younger generation do appear to be very, very influenced by the ideas that you're talking about. Here, they have almost no purchase of any kind, really, beyond a very, very narrow, sort of ultra-westernized section of the population.
This raises a number of questions. I'm going to follow up with a question about where you yourself stood on Oslo at the time, if you don't mind, because I think it would be interesting, given your expertise in political culture and military affairs. And I think as well, it would be nice to hear from you about the persistence of the two-state discourse to the extent that there is one here. There certainly is one in D.C. But let me ask you something prior to that, because you sparked my curiosity. We're talking about generational differences. The Jews, to be specific here, carrying guns and serving their country, are different from the Jews in the U.S. Now, I'm generalizing grossly, and I'm asking you to generalize. It goes without saying that we don't speak about the groups without exceptions. Everyone's an individual. That goes without saying. But to generalize about the U.S. as a whole, and I have to include the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, everyone in that multicultural society, self-sacrifice and valor, again, have been less visible than wokeness, whining, complaining, accusing others of microaggressions. We are one nation, אנחנו עם אחד. At the same time, can you give us your impression of Israeli Jews and American Jews, and then we'll move on? I mean, in regards to service to country and to the people.
Well, one thing which I would, suggest that we also pay attention to is the fact that the United States has not currently suffered a moment, and in a way, heaven forbid that it should, but has not suffered a moment comparable to October 7th. The 9/11, I remember back in, in the days when we were young and doing all this stuff out in the field, you and I 25 years ago, we had the Second Intifada, and then a year later, the United States suffered the terror attacks of 9/11. And there was this sense in which a generation of Americans at that point kind of entered our world in a certain sense. What followed then was a number of, a very, very strange period, I think, in American political history, where a successful long but successful counter-terror campaign against the Al-Qaeda network, which committed 9/11, was carried out, but by its nature is carried out, as such campaigns are carried out by a very small number of professionals a long way away from the public gaze. And then sort of two very ill-considered, enormous military undertakings took place as a result into Afghanistan, into Iraq, which did require the energies of a much larger number of young Americans, but which for many good reasons never became a kind of massive, and never came to be seen as a kind of massive generational undertaking for young Americans, which means that young Americans have never really been, this generation, or indeed the previous generation, have not been plunged into a kind of national maelstrom requiring all of their strength and all of their commitment in the way that Israel is currently engaged. And I think we should think about that, because what that means is that, I would say, at least in my estimation, it's not that American youth have been tested and found wanting. It's that American youth have not yet been tested. Israeli youth are currently, this generation is currently being tested, and it's passing, as we were saying before, in our estimation, I think, with flying colors. But American youth has not been tested. I wouldn't want to predict what will happen should the United States come under a real threat of the kind, by the way, which I think America has not been under, for 75 years or so. I mean, the last time would have been World War II. As students of history, we know, you and I know, that the Western generation of the 1930s was similarly regarded as by its predecessors as a generation lacking in forbearance, lacking in capacity, lacking in national commitment. This was a major part of the way that generation was looked at in the 1930s, famously in the British context, in the country that I was born in. Famously, the students of Oxford University, I think 37, voted on a motion of the Oxford Union, the motion that this House will not serve king and country. And that motion was passed by a great majority, and this led to a great deal of concern in the newspapers and so on. Well, the young people are saying they won't fight for king and country. It doesn't need even to be said that when 1939 came along and 1940 came along, that generation recruited itself to the armed forces of the Western Allies and performed magnificently. So I wouldn't want to say that, we can close the book and say that American youth is a lost cause. By no means whatsoever. America's in a different situation. American youth have not yet been tested, and we need to, we need a way, I think, to reserve judgment, perhaps, on this score.
Well, they may be at some point, hopefully not in our lifetimes, but could be. In a sense, the American population as a whole was tested on October 7 and found wanting, perhaps in the eyes of some with a certain ethical or moral sensibility. What I mean is, the question arose for America after October 7 is, how do you explain the level of support for Hamas of all places on the American college campus, Ivy League institutions and public institutions? The youth there engaged in a kind of tentifada, or an intifada of tents, setting up encampments, egged on by their professors. In a sense, this was a kind of test. I promised we'd get to this at some point in the interview. How does that look to somebody sitting at his desk or on his balcony, or in Jerusalem, or perhaps out in Iraq or Syria and other places? What do you think?
Well, I mean, what I think is just that there is, and you know this better than I, Gabe, but is that there is a set of ideas which have been purposefully promulgated in the American academy and in American intellectual life in recent decades, and in Western European intellectual life and campuses too. And it is a kind of, as I see it at least, it's kind of the latest incarnation of a sort of a Marxist or quasi-Marxist outlook, in which, the old left of the post-war period that believed, that put its faith, so to speak, in the industrial working classes of the West to be the instrument of revolution, has long passed from the scene. And the new left, the left that followed it in the 60s and 70s, that put a similar set of beliefs of faith in third world movements, which they regarded at least, or called at least, of national liberation, is now largely gone as well. But what's not happened is what perhaps we might thought would happen, which I think I, and perhaps you also after 1989, thought had happened, which is that Marxism had simply had its last iteration, and now its worthlessness, at least in terms of application, having been clearly established by the sort of the historic failure of the Soviet experiment in Russia, would now trouble us no further, so to speak. That has proven to be an optimistic calculation. For a while in the 1990s and maybe the subsequent decade, it did appear that of all the sort of proposed solutions, Marxian type solutions were no longer relevant except to a tiny number of increasingly superannuated people. That is no longer the case. A new iteration of that essential outlook has come onto the scene, has been purposefully promulgated with a great deal of success, especially in the context of university campuses. And this, if I might venture, is really the strangest incarnation of all, because while the old Marxism of belief in the industrial working classes, was logical unto itself in a certain sense, and while even the new left at least had the virtue that it was mainly supporting movements of people with a similar socialist or Marxist outlook to itself, that's to say, the new left romanticized the Castro revolution in Cuba, or the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, or maybe some of the movements in Southern Africa, MPLA in Angola and so on, who at least had the virtue that the members of those movements were similarly wrong about stuff, if I can put it that way, as were the Western new leftists themselves. But now what we have is an almost astonishing next incarnation of this, in which the Marxians, or people influenced by Marxist outlook on Western campuses, are putting their faith in and their support in peoples and movements who have diametrically opposed views of the world to themselves. That is to say, if we think of, they're putting their faith specifically in movements of political Islam. They are saying that movements of political Islam are the main instrument challenging what they regard as the imperialist West, or whatever they call it, the United States and its allies. And therefore, almost regardless of the beliefs of those movements, they must kind of be doing something right. Objectively, I think would be the Marxist level. Objectively, they're in the right. Now, this brings us to a point of ludicrousness and absurdity, which is kind of familiar, I think, to all of us watching this, which is where, to put it crudely or in a caricatured way, you have lesbian activists or trans activists on US campuses supporting what are basically far-right movements of political Islam, in whose view the correct judgment on the practice of homosexuality would be the imposition of the death penalty. Now, that is obviously a logical absurdity, but nevertheless, that appears to be the point which we have reached in terms of quite popular and quite active and impactful and influential movements on Western campuses, and to some degree also in Western capitals. Maybe less so in the US, where campus has remained very much the focus of this. But you think of London, for example, for week after week in the weeks following October 7th, you had impassioned demonstrations of literally hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in London. I went to one of those demonstrations once to report on it and to take some pictures. And it was fascinating to note about roughly half of the participants were themselves Muslims of Middle Eastern, or overwhelmingly of Middle Eastern or South Asian descent, of which, of course, there is a large population in the UK. But the other half, roughly 50%, were the people we're talking about. Clearly people of sort of, white native British ancestry, and with the kind of outlook we're talking about, who'd reached a point one could, if we want to be unkind about it, so to speak, had reached, a point of intellectual dereliction, at which they genuinely believed that, openly anti-Semitic, murderous movements of a deeply backward-looking orientation, promoting various types of fundamentalist Islam in their least, in an absolutely uncomplicated form or unambiguous form, were the instruments that these people regarded as the forces of progress. So that's the point we've reached. I think in terms of intellectual history, it's the next incarnation of a process with which we're both familiar. And it's a process, it's an incarnation which has reached a kind of point of absurdity, which the previous incarnations, mistaken as indeed they also were, did not ever quite manage to achieve.
Speaking of mistakes, where were you on the Oslo Accords way back when? Can you briefly perhaps suggest to us something about the ferment on that topic, and even what it was for an audience that may appreciate filling in some basic details in brief. And then, if I may, because in the interest of time, the question is hovering out there, I think even still today, amongst some segment of the Israeli population, of the two-state solution, or at least of the American population inside the, what do they call it, a Acela corridor around DC. What was your position on Oslo? And if I can give you a double-barrel question, where's the two-state quote-unquote solution at? Again, maybe this is three barrels in terms of Israeli public sentiment, and have you noticed that in Washington there's a strong push for it going on? So for Oslo and the two states where we are now.
Yeah, sure. So with regard to Oslo, I mean, I came to live in Israel in 1991 in my early 20s, and went straight into the military. And my own position when I arrived in the country, I'm from a conservative family, I would say, with quite a long tradition of involvement in Jewish and Zionist affairs, and a large section of the family also in Israel. So I was kind of grew up steeped in all that stuff from a young age. I would have said that when I arrived in the country, I would have been of a position which I guess would have been called then something like liberal Zionist. I was reading my David Grossman and Amos Oz, and I certainly was very committed to Zionism and to Israel, but also very much hoped and believed in the possibility of historic compromise with the Palestinians. To be honest with you, my service in the army in the West Bank and Gaza Strip was what disabused me of that illusion. It's not, I wouldn't point to any single event which took place. I just realized in the course of that service, which was in northern Gaza, in Beit Hanun and Jabalia refugee camp for what it's worth, and then in the West Bank in Hebron specifically, I realized that the depth of the conflict, the depth of animosity, and specifically the motivations on the part of the Arab Muslim side were not such as had been presented to me and my friends in London in Jewish or Zionist circles. So we'd been told a version of events which was, well, there's been a terrible conflict, a national conflict, and now both sides are getting towards readiness and willingness for a kind of uneasy compromise based on territorial partition. And I came rapidly to understand, I think, in the years of the early and mid-1990s, when I finished in the military at the end of 1993, and as I immersed myself in Israeli society, that no such readiness for historic compromise really existed, or rather it existed on the Israeli side, the Israeli Jewish side. It did not exist on the Palestinian Arab or broader Arab and Muslim side. And what was happening was that Israeli Jews, a section of Israeli Jews, I think out of a certain amount of intellectual incuriosity, and frankly also, may I say, to a degree out of a sense of, I think, superiority and condescension towards the Arab Muslim side, had simply sort of taken it upon themselves to decide for the Arab Muslim side that, yes, well, they were interested in historic compromise too. We're interested in it, so they must be interested in it too. And insofar as they say very clearly that they're not interested in it, which they do all the time in their media and in their cultural product and in their education system, well, we don't need to take that too seriously, because obviously, who knows better what they want, them or us? I mean, obviously us, because we're the clever ones, right? So, I'm being a bit unfair maybe, but that was really, I think, the prevailing intellectual climate in which the Oslo peace process was born, in which the notion of, bringing the Palestine Liberation Organization back from exile in Tunisia into the heart of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, to create an authority way before any such commitment to historic compromise on their part had been undertaken. It has never been undertaken, but the thought was, we'll start a process of negotiations and coexistence and establish a Palestinian authority. And in the course of that process of cooperation, they will also come to take, the more nuanced and compromising view of the conflict, which we on our side, or which our leadership was at that time committed to. I regarded it as an illusion, and I consequently became, in my own small way at the time, I was just a guy in his mid to late 20s, became, a person doing what I could in terms of my own writing and a degree of political activism also at that age, to try to disabuse my fellow country folk of the illusions which I thought and others thought were leading to disaster. And so we undertook those campaigns, and in some ways we were successful, I think. I mean, we prevented, I think, for example, dangerous possible concessions on the Golan Heights. Although, at the end of the day, our greatest assets in the end were, of course, the Arab side themselves, just because we'd accurately characterized them. So they behaved in the way that we said they were going to behave, which was by rejecting all possible compromise. Disaster came in 2000 with the collapse of the peace process, and our generation had a sort of 4-year insurgency to fight, which is still misnamed the Second Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We fought it successfully, and the Palestinian Arab Muslim insurgency was defeated by 2004. But yes, the illusions to some degree have been maintained. As we said at the beginning, I think Israel and Israeli Jews largely abandoned the illusions of the peace process that were dominant and predominant in the 1990s. And though they banished that in 2000, there's a reason why the so-called, or the Zionist left, what was the Labour Party and Meretz, had 56 seats in the Knesset at their height in 1992 at the birth of the peace process, and today they have 4 seats, the same camp, right? There's a reason for that. It's because Israelis realized that that they were selling illusions and decided not to purchase further. So from an Israeli point of view, I think there's been a certain abandonment of those illusions, and there's an awareness that we are in a long conflict against elements of the Arab and Muslim world, not the Arab and Muslim world in its entirety, but strong elements among it, and indeed the Muslim world beyond the Arab world, in the shape of Islamic Republic of Iran, of course, today as the main mover of armed opposition and action against Israel, and that therefore, hopes for final, settlement of the conflict need to be a little bit put on the back burner. We're nowhere near that. We're in the midst of a continued historic struggle in which we must either prevail or perish. And that's the urgent challenge, I think, which Israeli people are thinking about, rather than thinking about, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could solve the conflict this way or that? With regard to the Western world and the prevailing of the continued prevalence of the two-state illusion, what do I mean by the two-state illusion? We have the term uses two-state solution. What that really means is solving the conflict by partitioning the area of land west of the Jordan River. This is an illusion because the notion that would be satisfactory to the Palestinian Arab Muslim movement, which is the thing that we're fighting, is simply not accurate. That won't be enough to satisfy what they're looking for, as they say again and again and again on every available platform. Because what that movement exists to do is it exists to reverse the verdict of the 1948 war. That's what it came into being to do, and that's what it exists to do. It wants to have a rerun of the 1948 war in which the Arab Muslim side is victorious and the Israeli Jewish side is destroyed. That's the intention. You can't satisfy that intention by cutting the country in half and saying, well, you guys can have your own little state too, where you can run, sewage and the postal service. No, that's not what they're looking for. So it's an illusion. But yeah, it's an illusion that's hard dying in the West. And when I speak to Western diplomats, which I sometimes do, I'm often told something like the following: but if there isn't a two-state solution, then what is the solution? There has to be some kind of solution. And what I say to them is the following: you have to be realistic about it. What needs to happen west of the Jordan River is that we need to continue to manage security affairs in their entirety throughout that area of land. And within that, we should be looking to give, it's good for Arabs to rule Arabs, by all means. I have no interest in ruling Arabs, and neither do other Israeli Jews, I think, for the great majority. But that needs to take place in a context in which the prevailing and prevalent political and military forces on the other side are not given leeway to do harm to us as they wish to do. And that's the kind of arrangement we need to come to. By the way, arrangements of this kind, of one kind or another, are common throughout the region. And we need to some degree to adapt ourselves to regional realities and develop policy on that basis. I think doing it is, and how to do it is quite clear. Explaining it to Westerners who don't know the region is perhaps more challenging. But the key thing is to have practical policies that work and keep the maximum number of Israeli Jews, and indeed of Palestinian Arabs as well, safe from harm. And that's what I think we need to be looking to achieve.
How then do you explain the obsession in the Biden administration currently with imposing some kind of a commitment to a two-state solution on Israel at this time, By this time, I mean this time, with war with Gaza, with war in the north, that I think a lot of people around the world, in the US and other places, don't even know is happening.
Mm.
What do you think is going on with the Biden administration, as far as I can tell, extending significant pressure to commit to this two-state solution, which normal Israelis, average Israelis in the Jewish state will just simply say, well, two states, what will the people in the other state be like? Will they be like the people who streamed in on October 7th following the terrorists, thousands of them, ordinary citizens, to rape and pillage and kidnap our citizens? We would rather not consider them as neighbors in this regard, if we could help it. Go figure. And yet DC, I think, is pressuring Israel for this and has allies in the Israeli government leadership among the elites. Can you explain that?
Well, illusions die hard is all I can say. I mean, the people who currently are, in and around the administration in the United States are people from a similar outlook and from maybe even a similar time, in the case of the president himself, to the very people who created the illusions of the 1990s and who created, or still adhere to, if I can put it that way, a view of the region which erroneously holds it that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lies at the root of Middle East failure and instability. And therefore it is of urgent necessity, or of urgency, to solve that conflict in order to then solve the greater dysfunction that is so very apparent in the political affairs of the states of the Middle East. Now, this is just illusory, even if one wishes to say that it would be a good thing. And of course, it would be a nice thing if we could solve the conflict between ourselves and the Palestinian side. What ought to be now apparent to everybody after the period of the so-called Arab Spring, after the series of civil wars and revolutions and counter-revolutions that swept the Arab world following from late 2010 until, let's say, around, if we can put a lid in it, around late 2019, when the final ISIS strongholds in southeastern Syria fell. What took place in the region throughout that decade ought to have ended any further talk of the notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is at the center of regional affairs. And if you can address that, you'll be achieving a great deal for the region as a whole. This simply doesn't stand up to any test of reality. But I think that view of the region, which, by the way, remains very much the view of the region which is taught in Western universities, if you go to study the Middle East there, that version is simply not in touch with reality, but that's the version that most of the people in the US administration still adhere to. So they remain committed to ideas, in my estimation at least, which no longer have any real application in the world, but nevertheless, they remain committed to them. So when they're in positions of authority and power, they try their best to implement, that particular vision. And it doesn't get anywhere, and it won't get anywhere, but they'll continue to commit to it. There's a number of different illusions, I think, that you put on top of that now with this administration, because what I think they're trying to sell us, or what they're trying to sell, is this notion that, well, there's this amazing regional alliance just waiting for Israel, where Israel will ally with the countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Emirates and Bahrain, with whom Israel already has relations, under US leadership. And this will be the counter-Iran alliance. But all Israel must do is it must commit to the two-state vision in order to sort of get on board. Here's the thing: whether or not you want Israel to commit to the goal of two states, should Israel do so, will not have the result of creating some massive, powerful new alliance against Iran. Insofar as there is cooperation against Iran between Israel and the states of the Gulf, the Arab states of the Gulf, it's on the basis of shared interests. Those shared interests have nothing to do with whether Israel is committed to the two-state solution or not. They to do with the fact that Israel and those countries have common enemies. There is already a lot of practical on-the-ground cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Having said all that, what took place on the night of April 13th, when the Iranians tried to attack Israel with almost 300 ballistic missiles and drones, and almost all of those were taken down, was a manifestation at the end of the day of American and Israeli air defense. Let's be brutally clear here. Israeli air defense is not, I'm afraid, dependent on the air defense capacities of Bahrain or even Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Those aren't the things that are going to keep Israel safe from Iranian ordnance. It is going to be mainly the Israeli capacity itself, and hopefully maybe also, I think also importantly, assistance from our American friends deployed in various parts of the region. That's what really matters. And that has nothing to do this two-state solution one way or another. So I think it's simply that, you know, old styles of thought remain, even if they've been disproved by reality, remain in the heads of important policymakers. So those policymakers set about trying to once again apply them to reality, unsurprisingly with similar results to the results that were experienced in the past.
Last thing on this, and then we move ahead to our chronological agenda of covering last year to where we are now. Does it matter to kind of leapfrog off of what you just said? There's an elephant in the room. Does it matter to Israelis who's elected in the U.S. in 2024 or not? Is that kind of a faraway concern in other countries' politics?
I think it does matter, but having said that, I think if we look at the history of the last three administrations, that's to say that of Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden, there is a certain amount of commonality on the Middle East. I mean, the rhetoric may have been very different, but actually I think all the way from Obama, you know, without exception up until today, there was commonality in the following sense. The United States is reluctant to undertake, does not wish to undertake new major commitments inland and upstream in the Middle East. The United States is busy with other stuff. It's busy with its domestic affairs. It's busy with the new and emergent historic challenge of a peer competitor in the People's Republic of China. It's new. It's busy with, you know, the re-emergence of large-scale conventional warfare in Europe for the first time in 70 years. So it has lots on its plate right now, and it doesn't want new commitments in the Middle East, especially when it is considered that the United States in the last quarter century undertook two very costly and very unsuccessful commitments upland and inland and upstream in the Middle East. Iraq, and of course, I mean, Afghanistan is technically South Central Asia, but nevertheless, you know, in the Muslim world, let's say, Afghanistan too. So there's no bandwidth, there's no willingness, there's no desire for new and major commitments. There is a desire to get out and keep out insofar as it's possible. In this respect, I would suspect there may well not be an enormous change in the core elements of Middle East policy between if Biden wins or whoever it is for the Democrats by November wins or Donald Trump wins. Biden is at least, the difference in the two, I think, is the following way. Biden is at least predictable both in his commitments and in his deficiencies. Trump is different. Trump is unpredictable. I mean, if we think of Trump, of two key moments in the Trump first term in the Middle East, we can see that the way in which he's unpredictable. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia was hit, if you remember, in September 2019 by a major Iranian Houthis, but Iranian drone attack on the oil processing plants in a place called Khurais and Abqaiq. And contrary to expectations, the Americans didn't respond. So this was taken as evidence of the fact that, you know, Donald Trump, like his predecessor, wanted out, didn't want to get re-involved in the Middle East, certainly wasn't going to get wrapped up in a war in the Middle East against Iran on behalf of this or that regional ally. But then a few months later, Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani on the road from Baghdad airport in January 2020, alongside Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the commander of the Iraqi Shia militias, and a number of other lesser figures. So sometimes Trump was very, very assertive in a way that, you know, completely broke the mold. And other times he was hesitant. And other times, for example, when he ordered suddenly the withdrawal of US forces from Syria and then reversed the decision a few weeks later, he was doing a bit of both. So, you know, it's likely, it would seem to me, that both the Trump of September 2019 and the Trump of January 2020 will return to the White House if Trump returns. And you won't be quite sure on any given day which one you're going to get. And sometimes you'll be very happy with the one you get, maybe much more so than you would be with the kind of staid establishment pattern of activity of Joe Biden. And other times you might be disappointed with what you get. So that's my sense. I don't think there's a desire on the part of either candidate to come rushing and roaring back into the Middle East. There are significant differences, but there's also a sense of predictability on the one hand, unpredictability on the other. Those will be my immediate thoughts, at least in that regard. So yes, it's certainly important. It certainly matters. I think to some degree, maybe if I may venture to say, it may matter more, and it may matter on a historic level, actually, for American internal political history. And I think it might matter also on a historic level for American attitudes and commitments in Europe, and specifically perhaps in the issue of the Ukraine war. In the Middle East, I think perhaps it matters. It may come to matter slightly less. That's my sense.
We shall see. American politics today, yes, we shall, are about as interesting as Israeli politics, which is saying a lot. For once, American politics make Israeli politics look relatively sane. But be that as it may, I think it was the French diplomat of what was it, the 18th and 19th century, Talleyrand, who said of something, some decision that a diplomat had made, which he disagreed with. He said it was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. Has Israel's been accused of crimes by certain organizations like the ICC, the ICJ, and more broadly, because that's kind of getting into the weeds with those orgs. If you want to talk about them, feel free. I think the world should know what they are. I don't think the world knows what they are, but more broadly, there is a sense in the world that Israel, amongst some segment of global civil society, that Israel may have committed crimes. On the other hand, inside of Israel, we debate what mistakes might have made in getting from last year to this year. Has Israel committed crimes? And since that's a relatively simple question to answer, I think, have there been mistakes?
Oh, in terms of crimes, I mean, everything which I can gauge, and that's also from observing the war, observing the available figures, and reading remarks and responses of reputable military analysts from Western countries, from the United States, from the United Kingdom. All of that body of evidence suggests to me, without any real need to caveat this, that the Israeli military behavior in the Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip fits absolutely within, at the very least, within Western norms. And you can even make a case that Israel is, to some degree, making efforts to safeguard civilian life of a kind that was not undertaken by other Western associated armies fighting comparable enemies. And I would think, for example, of the Iraqi and Kurdish forces that allied with United States air power to fight Islamic State in the period from 2014 to 2019. And I witnessed a large part of that war as a correspondent. And you can make a case that Israel is carrying out measures to safeguard civilian life, which those forces did not undertake. So the notion that that Israel is sort of committed genocide, I believe is the term used by some of the campus activists and so on. You know, it's not only inaccurate; it has the virtue that good propaganda should have. It's not trying to engage halfway with reality. The best propaganda doesn't do that. It's just creating a completely false picture. You know, a picture which is false from start to finish, which is the opposite of truth. And that's how good propaganda works. If you really want to brainwash a population, don't say, well, there's a little bit to this view, but create a completely fictional picture in which your audience can live, completely fictional informational space, and then feed that space in which your audience can intellectually inhabit. And that's what's been achieved. A considerable public in the West are simply living within a completely illusory and false picture of what is taking place in Gaza. With regard to mistakes, so this is regarding crimes. Regarding mistakes, I don't think that the military effort is being, on a strategic level, run particularly successfully. I think that on the ground, the army is performing extremely well, but it is not clear to me, frankly, what the military campaign currently in Gaza is trying to achieve, because we are told that major combat operations will shortly be winding down. The intensity of the campaign in Gaza is already at a far lower level than was the case in December or January at its height, when it was at its height. But very clearly, Hamas is not defeated. Very clearly, the Hamas Authority has not been destroyed. And whilst I read the Washington Post report yesterday, which was talking about the imminent arrival of a new force of 2,500 Palestinians vetted by Israel security force, supported by the moderate Arab states, which would take over governance in the Gaza Strip. Well, that was a very interesting piece. I'm not sure if it was accurate or not. It was a very interesting piece. I don't quite see how we get from here to there when we currently have a situation in which Hamas, in fact, remains in control of large parts of the Gaza Strip. And wherever Israeli forces are removed, Hamas reasserts itself. Now, if we are heading, as I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu hinted in a recent speech, back towards a situation of what we used to call mowing the lawn here, which means that, the Gaza Strip is still ruled by Hamas, and every so often when it gets out of hand, we kind of punish it. That's the mowing of the lawn bit. If that's where we're headed, I can tell you from my point of view, that is an entirely inadequate response to the enormity of the events of October 7th and to the enormity of the strategic challenge that Israel faces. What do I mean by that? Two things. Firstly, anything less as a response to October 7th, anything less than the complete destruction of the Islamist political authority in Gaza, which ordered the attacks of October 7th, anything less than that is completely inadequate as a response, firstly. And secondly, more broadly, through complacency and overconfidence, in my estimation, Israel allowed over the last quarter century the emergence and build-up of two Iran-supported Islamist armies on its borders, one in Gaza Strip, the Hamas forces, the other far more consequential and dangerous one on the northern border, Lebanese Hezbollah. And I consider it to be a matter of strategic urgency for Israel to destroy those Islamist armies. That is the task facing Israeli security policy at the present time. It must be achieved before Iran goes nuclear. If Iran does go nuclear, and that isn't prevented, and Iran is now tantalizingly close to going nuclear. If Iran goes nuclear, it will no longer be possible to destroy those armies. Those armies are committed to the slow bleeding to death of Jewish sovereignty west of the Jordan River. That's how important this is. So this is a historic challenge and a historic struggle. It is, in my opinion, of urgent necessity that Israel destroy both those Islamist armies. And if we're settling for something far, far, far less than that, both in the Gaza front and the northern front, then I think we're making a big mistake, and it'll be a mistake which we will regret in the future.
Was the division of the country that we all were aware of a year ago a mistake? And while nobody wants to engage in finger pointing during a war, ask anybody, they'll tell you that that's distasteful. Meanwhile, everybody does it. If not everybody, but there's a lot. Let's see if we can examine that and other things in terms of how we got from last year to this year. With everything you just said, front of mind, top of mind, to shift gears a little bit. How what were the judicial reforms that were proposed, and why were they so alarming to some that the country seemed to be almost ungovernable, up to the point where there were threats of soldiers, pilots, to not necessarily fulfill their duties? I believe along similar lines, it was Yoav Gallant in his role of what, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Minister of Defense at the time, who said out loud that this could be contributing to a disarray and an unreadiness to some degree in the IDF. This is before October 7. What were the reforms that were proposed supposed to do, and why did some reject this so strongly that it might have looked that we were somewhat more vulnerable than usual?
Well, I mean, the reforms, without going into huge detail, I think everyone is aware, were to do with the issue of the extent and nature of judicial overview of legislation, with one side believing that the proposed reforms weakened judicial overview of legislation to a point where that became a danger to the proper functioning of Israeli democracy, and the other side feeling that, in fact, over the years, the courts had overreached themselves and awarded themselves a kind of quasi-constitutional role, which was not justified, and which ended up with sort of vague concepts, such as the famous one was reasonability or reasonableness, which allowed judges to sort of de facto legislate or issue edicts on the basis, since we don't have a written constitution in Israel, on the basis of their own particular preferences or perhaps prejudices. I mean, that's a crude way, so to speak, of laying down the debate. Look, it's an important issue, I think, and everyone has their own opinion on it. My own view, at least, is that the whole concept of reasonableness in the context of a country that doesn't have a written constitution is inherently problematic. It would appear to me, at least, lend itself to a situation in which judges can overreach and can overstep their authority. But having said that, there are cases that can be made on either side, certainly. My own view was that whatever one wants to say about Rothman and Yariv Levin and the haste in which they appeared to wish to push through the reforms, I did feel that the response to it was excessive on the face of it, simply because I would say to friends of mine who were taking part in the demonstrations against judicial reform, well, what about the idea of forming a political party and defeating the current party legitimately and legally ruling in the country, and then you can reverse the reforms or implement anything you like. That's the nature of elected authority. And I never really, frankly, got a good answer to that. I found that people said things like, yeah, but you don't understand, if this reforms go through, there won't be any more elections. There was this kind of idea, well, this is kind of the first step in a process of dismantling Israeli democracy and Israeli electoral processes. And I would say, well, yeah, there isn't really any evidence for that. I mean, I understand that you don't like the prime minister. I mean, the person I'm imagining here doesn't like the prime minister and thinks he's like Erdogan and so on. But there isn't really any, and maybe there's, you can argue that, the prime minister certainly has many faults and I think made huge errors and is, in my opinion, responsible for, since he's the helmsman, responsible for October 7th and should have resigned the day after. But having said all that, if you don't like the prime minister, there is still a way to replace him in its elections. And I feel that threatening to refuse to serve in the armed forces for a set of beliefs which you could have in fact tried to promote through legal democratic means was excessive. Now, again, is that what led Sinwar to think, oh, these people have got so weak now it's time to launch the jihad of October 7th? I don't know. And frankly, I don't think that would have been foremost in his mind. I don't think anybody seriously looking at Israel thought Israel is about to collapse. Israel is so weak that all it takes now is a little push, no country will collapse. No, I don't think that the people on the other side are so naive and so ignorant of our ways and of our political processes. There have been heated protests in this country before. It's clear they don't herald the collapse or death of the country. They're just part of the way that Israel sometimes and Israelis sometimes like to conduct their affairs. So, I would have my own hesitations and reservations regarding those demonstrations. I don't particularly agree or sign on to what the people there were demonstrating for. But the notion that, if you people hadn't been out demonstrating, Sinwar wouldn't have attacked seems to me to be, frankly, a ludicrous and unsupportable and unsupported assertion. So that's how I would conclude it.
And one should add, say so if you disagree, that among those threatening not to show up for duty are well, basically 100%, as far as I know, courageous soldiers, pilots, and soldiers who for many years and decades have served the country.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. And secondly, let us remember, I mean, as far as I'm aware, at least, the proposal for judicial reform have not been shelved. And nevertheless, the current number of people that didn't turn up for duty after October 7th because of the judicial reforms, as far as I'm aware, is currently at 0. Right? Not even one person has decided, okay, well, I told you I wouldn't show up, and hey, I'm not showing up. That person does not exist. So, yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think that should put in perspective, the extent of this. Israeli political language tends to veer towards extremes, and usually those extremes are not accompanied by then similarly extreme behavior. Now, this is a difference in culture. It's different between what do we call it, the Anglo-Saxon cultures, they're called here, that you and I grew up among, the English-speaking cultures, and the culture of Israel. Language is used differently. If violence is threatened in an English-speaking country, usually violence is not threatened. And if it is threatened, you're probably thinking actual violence will follow, right? That tends to be how I look at the English-speaking cultures with which we're both very familiar. In the Israeli case, these kind of threats are often used as a way of I would say, blowing off steam. And one needs to get used to that different use of political language in order to sometimes accurately gauge what's going on. That's at least how I would see it.
Okay, well, we're not almost out of time, but we are almost. out of time. How then, well, bearing in mind, again, I have to say in passing that not only did those who threatened not to show up, but more than were called up for reserve duty on the day of October 7th and 8th showed up. Jews, Israelis, Jewish Israelis from around the world flew back into a war zone to show up and volunteer to serve. There weren't enough guns and helmets to go around, and that applies to those who, had the political view that they were very, they're very much committed to one side in the judicial reform debate. But nonetheless, you mentioned solidarity earlier, so I acknowledge that in passing, and toward the aim of wrapping up, I want to know where we are now, but before that, I want to know where you were on October 7, Jonathan. I haven't actually asked you this.
No, the answer is I was at home with I was with my family in London for Simchat Torah, so I was actually flying back to Israel on October 7th. I got one of the last Virgin Atlantic flights flying out of London and arriving in Tel Aviv. I got one of the last ones, and the next one was cancelled. So then I arrived in the country in the late afternoon and made my way back to a very silent and deserted Jerusalem, which is where I live. And then on October 8th, a colleague of mine drove down to the Gaza envelope area to begin our job of reporting the events, which we haven't really stopped since that day doing.
Well, you're accustomed to flying into war zones, so but anyway, of course you wanted.
And we saw some bodies there, and we saw some very strange sights. But you're aware. I mean, October 8th.
Tell us.
We didn't know. Well, it wasn't really over, of course. At the time, people. Something I've noticed in my years, I suppose, of reporting and conflict is that people have a very great desire to think that normality has returned. People do it very quickly. Yeah, something happened terrible 5 minutes ago, but now we're already getting back to normal. This seems to be a kind of human instinct. And I think that my colleague and I kind of fell for that, like many other Israelis, on October 8th. We drove down there, and our thought was something terrible happened yesterday, and we're going to go and see the aftermath of it. Because in reality, as we now know, it was still going on October 8th. I said there were still pockets of terrorists active in a variety of locations along the Gaza border. The border had been sealed, but there were still many terrorists on the other side, and still quite a lot to be done. So we actually kind of probably went to some of those places a bit earlier than we should have done. But nevertheless, it was fascinating to see that. Well, fascinating. It was horrifying and affecting. To see that the broken landscape of the Gaza envelope on the morning of October 8th. In which corpses of terrorists were still strewn around, broken cars, vehicles, shocked people, So this was what we saw, and it was a very affecting thing to see.
Where are we now? How did we get from October 7th to here, and where are we going next? What are the conundrums on the horizon as we start to wrap up? How do we get here? Where are we now?
My sense is that where we are now is that I think we may be in the process of beginning to wrap up the Gaza campaign. I think we're still quite some way away from an agreement on the hostages. Obviously, negotiations are taking place in Doha, and senior Israeli officials are there at the moment taking part in those negotiations alongside Western and Arab officials too, from Egypt and from the Gulf also. My sense is that we're still some way away from settling that issue. Combat is winding down in Gaza. I don't think there is going to be a resounding victory against Hamas at the present time, but I wouldn't want to rule that possibility out. I mean, the combat's still ongoing, and perhaps too soon to draw any sort of real conclusions. Combat's ongoing, and we hope for the best. I hope that combat ends with the destruction, clear and obvious, of the Hamas Authority in Gaza and its replacement by something else. Whether the something else will be a period of Israeli occupation or whether the something else will be some kind of successor authority remains to be seen. What's vital, in my view, is that Hamas Authority be destroyed, and it's not yet clear if it will be. Regarding the North, Similarly, what I'm hearing from friends and colleagues in close to or in the senior parts of the Israeli military is there is a reluctance right now to contemplate major operations against Hezbollah, which means that what it's currently looking like is that one way or another we'll get back to something like the status quo ante bellum in the north, of Hezbollah still being deployed close to the border, and at some stage Israelis in the north being encouraged to return to their homes. That's not satisfactory from my point of view, for reasons I think outlined earlier. But that currently, I think, does seem to be where we're heading. As far as I can see, it appears that there is a complete veto is perhaps not the word, but the United States administration has said to Israel, do not go to war in the north. And if you do, then you don't expect America to be behind you in that situation. And also with an army, a field army that's been fighting for 9 months now, and people are tired and stocks are depleted, it appears that a major campaign to dislodge Hezbollah close to the border is looking less and less likely. As I said, without wishing to sound like a warmonger, which I'm certainly not, or rattling of sabers or anything like that, I'm worried that if action isn't taken soon against Hezbollah in Lebanon, then we'll regret it further down the line. Things will probably become necessary further down the line, which we could prevent if we act soon. So I think, from my point of view, if we end up with a return to status quo ante bellum in the north and not destroying the Hamas Authority in Gaza, then we will have responded insufficiently to the challenge that was laid down, to the gauntlet that was thrown down on October 7th, if I can put it that way. I'm not saying we're necessarily at that point, but I think there's some quite worrying or quite concerning indications right now that we may be heading in that direction.
We're in the midst of an unpredictable situation and of a crucial circumstance of existential proportions. Perhaps we'll meet here again in a year if we can convince you to see where we're at there, where we're at that point. Meanwhile,
so it's always a pleasure talking to you.
For now, Maspik, Nitray Bekorov, and Lo Noflim Medot Shach.
Absolutely. Good talking to you, Gab.